The book of Deuteronomy, the author is Moses, and the date of the book where it was written is assumed to be between 1265 and 1220 BC, between the time Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt and up to the point of his death. The purpose and summary of this book: this is the final book of the Pentateuch, which derives its English name from the Greek word deuteronomion, meaning second law or law repeated. And so the two words is deuteronomios or nomion. And again, Deuteronomy is especially Moses' farewell address to an entire new generation, which is why he repeats the law. He summons them to hear the law of God. He instructs them in the application of its principles to the new circumstances awaiting them, and has them renew the covenant that God had made with their fathers, a covenant that must be faithfully observed as a condition of God's blessing upon them in the promised land. See that you do are the words of Moses to the people in Deuteronomy 12:32. He wanted them to be doers of the word, not just hearers. And the book shows the blessings of obedience and the curses of disobedience. Everything depends on obedience, life itself. It's the possession of the promised land, victory over enemies, prosperity, and happiness. We find that this book of teaching and the inflexibility of the law, that it's a mandate. You shall and you shall not occurs over and over again. And you can find this in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And there is the blessing if you obey and the curse if you disobey. And you find these phrases in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 27 and 28. So the book of Deuteronomy is a collection of the instructive speeches and songs that Moses gave as his farewell to the children of Israel. Moses delivered his addresses probably within a period of 7 days or so, about a month before the crossing of the Jordan River, as he stood on the great divide between his earthly and heavenly life. You find this Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. And from the top of the Mount Nebo, sometimes called Mount Pisgah, he recalled over a century crammed full of epoch-creating events. Then he turned his gaze to the future of the people he was about to leave. And this book contains a most interesting and instructive summary of the wilderness history of Israel. And in the last chapter, we find an account of Moses himself. Carefully compare Moses' review of the events with the account given in Exodus and Numbers. And you'll find that Deuteronomy gives the divine rather than the human view. It's God's perspective. In particular, compare Deuteronomy 1 with Numbers chapters 13 to 14. After telling the Israelites what blessings would be theirs if they obeyed, Moses also told them of the results of disobedience. And so chapter 28 tells us what Israel might have been through obedience. Moses then spoke to 80-year-old Joshua, committing the leadership of the Israelites to him. And after Moses had sung a song, he went up to Mount Nebo and died after God had shown him the promised land. And it's the immaterial whether Moses wrote Deuteronomy 34 by revelation or whether Joshua added it later, which there's a debate about that. But we know this: they wept for him 30 days before they entered the promised land. They mourned over the loss of Moses, and you see their love for him. And so what are some of the key elements? Deuteronomy is a book of remembrance. Again, the name Deuteronomy means second law or repeat of the law, which indicates that the law is in repetition. Moses did this to remind the people what God had done for them and what they were to do to serve God when they reached the promised land. It omits the things that relate to the priests and the Levites, but includes the things that the everyday person should know. And it covers only about 2 months, including the 30 days of mourning for Moses. This book is the last of the 5 books of Moses. These 5 books are called the Pentateuch, meaning 5 books. Genesis tells the beginning of the chosen nation, Israel. Exodus relates the organization of the people into a nation and the giving of the law. Leviticus tells the way God's chosen people were to worship God. Numbers gives a story of the wanderings of God's people. And Deuteronomy, this book, relates to the final preparation for entering the promised land. And I would encourage you, as you read it in a single sitting. Nothing in literature matches the majesty and the glory of the way this is written. And nothing in the Old Testament has a more powerful appeal for the spiritual life. And no book in all the Word of God pictures better the life according to God's will and the blessings that come with it, like this book in Deuteronomy. And so the structure of the book, we find this. In Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 4, this is Moses' first address. He's looking back. He's remembering what was. And then chapters 5 through 26, this is Moses' second address. He's looking up. It's about God. It's about God's nature and who He is and how we're to relate with Him. And then in chapters 27 and 33, this is Moses' third address. He's looking out. He's looking out and letting them know how to live their life. And then in chapter 34, this is Moses' final perspective. He's looking down. This is where the children of Israel mourn 30 days. He goes to Mount Nebo and he's looking down at the promised land, the land that he never got to enter, but yet he was able to see it. And the key verse in the book of Deuteronomy comes out of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 to 20. It's where it says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying His voice, and by holding fast to Him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to them. This is the key passage for this book. And so how is Jesus portrayed in Deuteronomy? He's known as the great prophet. Moses was known as a great prophet, but Jesus is known, he's portrayed here as the greatest prophet, the great one. And other points to remember as you read this book. Because God's people are His, He wants them to walk in the world in the way that represents and is appropriate to them. And He tells them what they should do. He tells them, separate yourself from evil in Deuteronomy 14. He shows charity towards fellow humans. He's saying show compassion towards one another in Deuteronomy 15. He says gather together in worship in Deuteronomy 16. And then he says be disciplined, live a disciplined life in Deuteronomy 17. This is the book of Deuteronomy. And Caleb. And the geography of the book takes us from 1, Sinai to Kadesh, 2, from Kadesh around and back to Kadesh, and 3, from Kadesh straight to the border of Canaan, the promised land. And this is the book of Numbers.